and then I'll put it back. Okay, that's easier for me. Thank you. All right, everyone. I think we're going to get started here. Do I need to turn the volume up? Oh, that's much better. Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started, everyone. Finish up your conversations for a second. Thank you. Much appreciated. All right. Wow, packed house tonight. Thank you, everyone, for your cooperation. As we sent out an email this morning, everyone confirmed their tickets because we really had a lot of demand for this show, and I think there might be a couple of seats left in the house, but it's very, very tight. It's my great pleasure to be with you all here tonight, thinking about why history matters. It's been a while since I have felt on a day that history mattered more as we mull over the landslide that just happened south of us. I've heard Trump compared to Nixon, and I've heard him compared to Reagan. I've even heard him compared to Grover Cleveland back in the 1890s, apparently the last president to be elected for a non-consecutive term. And I think also history matters as we reflect on the history of American democracy and how robust it is. So let us all raise our glasses and hope that it is indeed robust. I think history will certainly matter going forward. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Tom Saunders, who will be touching on the achievements and the limits of democracy in a classic context in Germany's Weimar Republic. Tom is not a stranger to this audience. Back in 2017, he spoke on the Berlin Wall. And Tom, is that the only one? I feel like you've done a second one. That was the one? Okay. Well, it's good that you're back then. Tom is a scholar, first and foremost, of Weimar and Nazi Germany. His early work was in the history of cinema in Europe, and especially on documentary films such as those of Leni Riefenstahl, from which we get his 1994 book, Hollywood in Berlin, American Cinema and Weimar Germany, which was published with University of California Press. Since then, his interests have expanded. He has explored and published papers on multiple aspects of interwar Germany, at times looking at Hitler and the breakdown of democracy, at other times looking at the social and the cultural side of what was happening. To cite just a few, images of prostitution in Weimar cinema, self-help and state rescue, I'm going to mess up this word, the Raiffeisen Bank? Raiffeisen, thank you, and rationalization of the cooperative movement in Weimar Germany, and women and nations in films in the Great War, I should say, sorry. The most recent project that Tom is embroiled in is entitled Villains, Victims, Saviors, Corruption and Scandal in a Weimar Hall of Mirrors. Teaser's coming out this year in a selection of published papers from the University of Toronto Press, and the book is underway. So Tom recently retired just this past July. We are all in disbelief at that the department can go on without him, in fact. He was chair when I was hired. I have always considered him a mentor, so it's a great pleasure for me to introduce him. Before he left, he taught the mainstay course on Weimar and Nazi Germany, which is extremely popular. Sometimes we offer it twice in 1 year. There's so much student demand. As well as broader European history. He came up with a new course on Hitler that students also were interested in, and a seminar as well on his first love, a seminar on European cinema and society in the first half of the 20th century. He also taught the honors historiography seminar for years, a theory seminar, full year course with some very strong students, a task which has now fallen to me, and those are very big shoes to fill, I can tell you. Luckily for us, Tom doesn't seem to be leaving academia anytime soon, although he does really enjoy getting out on his mountain bike, so it's possible that we might shift a little bit more to more mountain biking and less writing. In addition to the Scandals project, he's been deepening his reading on the philosophy of history, on contemporary affairs, reflecting on the relevance of history in our modern world, so he's perfect for this series. I couldn't imagine it without him. So please join me in welcoming my colleague, my mentor, my friend, Tom Saunders.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'll get the mic set here so you can hear me. Thanks to Jill for the introduction. I was tempted when this invitation came from her to immerse you in deep theoretical questions. She discouraged me. Rightly. So what I'd like to do is, because we're such a mix of backgrounds, I'm sure, is spend some time just outlining the main contours of the Weimar Republic, Germany's republic after the First World War. And then I will reflect, for a few moments at least, on what it all might mean as we think about democratic resilience, democratic potential, and the question that is the question for this series, why history matters, which is, what can historians really say about these things? So there's a self-critical, self-reflective piece to this, which is one of the things I enjoy. So let's start with a map of Germany after the First World War, which shows the various states and regions. I have a subsequent map which will better outline losses of territory. We don't need to worry about that at this moment. Several things to say. In the aftermath of the First World War, there were three outcomes for upheaval. One of them was the breakup of multinational empires, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. A second was social political revolution of the kind that occurred in the Soviet Union. And the third was a revolution of the political system without transformation of the socioeconomic structure. And it's the third one that we're dealing with. And that in itself poses challenges and interesting responses from the population. So Germany underwent a revolution. I would actually say three revolutions, but for the purposes of our talk tonight, I'm going to limit it to one after the First World War, in which it went from being a semi-parliamentary autocratic state to a democracy, a republic, with full male and female, for the first time, suffrage, and in which the parties, for the first time, had responsibility for governing. Prior to this, there were parties, a half dozen major parties. They were represented in Parliament, or what was known as the Reichstag, but they did not make policy. They voted a budget, the key part of which was military, and they had lots to say, but they did not form government. So that is transformed. At the same time, Weimar had a president elected separately to a 7-year term, likewise by equal suffrage. And the president was given specific powers to dissolve the Reichstag, call elections, to appoint chancellors. Also was given special powers under what was known as Article 48 to deal with emergencies, to be able to step in the event of problems in the country, including what we could call misbehavior by the individual states, failure of the states to follow the guidelines of the Constitution. So what had been a confederation of princes prior to 1918 became a confederation of democratic states. And you can see from this map that the state of Prussia, which is there in the yellowy brown, made up about 60% of the country. The national government had powers not unlike the division of powers that we're familiar to, or responsibilities, taxation, military, and foreign policy, and the individual states oversaw justice, education, religion, and social welfare. I should just add, because I'm going to go to some slides here in a moment, that this is also a constitution which provides full equal rights before the law for women. So I thought it would be useful to compare, partly for that reason, but also because these two images let us see the difference between hope and gloom in the aftermath of the First World War, going into the first elections of January 1919. On the left, the Social Democratic Party, SPD. You can see the caption is, women and girls come out of the gloom, take your place and vote for the National Assembly. And then on the other side, so the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, was the chief winner, if you like, from the revolution of 1918. It was the party that had pushed for democratization for decades, along with two others, the Left Liberals and the Centre Party. On the right-hand side, the main loser from defeat in 1918 and from the revolution was the German Nationalist Party, DNVP. And you can see a much darker view of what is in front of them. The caption says, "German women, wake up." You can see the hand coming around behind them. "Do your duty. This election of January 1919 will decide Germany's fate and the fate of your children." Language that sounds rather familiar, does it not? Yeah. And then another one, the SPD, again, the hopeful here, men and women, but this is about women, equal rights and equal duties. And then the reverse, again a picture of impending, looming catastrophe from the right-hand side. Here we have the ship of, or the carriage of state being run into a revolutionary swamp, which is what the red is below. And it's a portrayal, of course, of doom and death and fate. So the democratization of the political system, as I said, did not include socio-economic changes in a radical sense, nor did it include reshaping of inherited institutions from the imperial period. Essentially, it was the same civil service, essentially the same judicial system, and military, even though the military was massively shrunk by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The judiciary in particular was notoriously conservative or reactionary. The evidence here is that left-wing political crimes were punished at a much higher and sharper rate than were those from the right. Something that's not, we'll come to this in a second, something that's not so frequently remarked is that the press, whose role for us, of course, remains central, the press itself was a carryover from the imperial period. The majority of the press was not, interestingly, political, at least overtly. It claimed to be bipartisan. There were political papers for each of the major half-dozen parties. But in practice, especially what was known as the provincial press outside the major centers, in towns and smaller cities, was still steeped in the values of Imperial Germany. And this was a matter of some concern for those center-left and farther left in the Weimar Republic. Third thing to say is that also carried over from the imperial regime were the social structures, as I've suggested, but in particular as they were associated with politics. Historians call this social cultural milieu, organized by class, by religion, and region. One of the things I emphasize with my students, very difficult for us to fathom, certainly for the younger generation because it's unusual now, but you can't talk about this period really well without talking about religion. It's baked into allegiance, political allegiance, cultural association, friendships, networks, clubs. The difference between Catholic and Protestant or Lutheran. And then the question of Jews in Germany is another one entirely, which I'm not going to talk about directly here, but happy to respond to questions on it. The fourth thing, and this we come to here, is that democratization, of course, followed defeat. And the new state had to deal with the consequences, the very real consequences left behind, including cost. Challenges of demobilization of a massive army, millions strong, retooling of the economy for peacetime. At the end of the war, industrial production was barely half of what it was in 1913. So the impact on the overall economy was profound. And then a mountainous national debt. Germany paid for the war by borrowing. It only covered about 1/7 of its cost. The idea, no surprise, was to make the defeated enemy pay. which of course is precisely what Germany was asked to do or demanded of Germany after the war. But this Germans certainly planned to do. When that didn't work out, Germany was left with a massive bill. And then on top of that, and this was not unique to Germany, but given the way it had paid for the war and how it anticipated being able to make someone else reimburse those costs, it had very major outlays for things like pensions to permanently disabled war veterans, war widows, fatherless children. In 1926, payments to those three groups took up about 1/3 of the disposable income for the national government. The numbers, just to give you an idea, about 800,000 veterans with disabilities were on state pensions at that point, about 360,000 war widows, and 850,000 fatherless children. So, Treaty of Versailles, you can see the black regions, they were carved out of Germany according to the terms of the treaty. In the middle, if you can read it, you have the details, which I won't go to, about the other kinds of losses of population, of resources, and so on. Based on the article in the treaty which said Germany was responsible for the war. That was the pretext, if you like, on which to extract these kinds of payments. The sum of all this is that in 1918-19, at the time the Republic was formed, Germany was a far poorer country than it had been 5 years earlier. Fundamentally poorer country. Smaller too, smaller population, but above all, poorer. How did that play in politics? Well, it didn't make political life easy. In the 14 years of the Weimar Republic, there were 20 changes of government and 12 different chancellors. You can see a number of those. You can't read the fine print, but a number of them, like Marx, for instance, were chancellors more than once. Their governments were reconstituted, so they had multiple opportunities to lead. The fact that Germany, and this is the other thing to say, all governments were coalition governments. It was a half dozen major parties. No party had a majority. So throughout the period, coalition agreements were required. On the one hand, that can be seen as a weakness. I think it's worth contemplating whether it can also be a strength. That is, whether coalitions provide ways of navigating types of compromise that can arrive at goals that otherwise might not be attained. The central challenge with these coalitions is it was very difficult to patch coalitions together which agreed on both foreign policy and domestic policy. The class line cut through that. There could be agreement across classes on foreign policy between the working class and owners. In the case of the one party, much more difficult to get that agreement on social policy, needless to say. And that bedeviled the attempt to make parties, to make coalitions that were functional and lasted. The other thing that's striking and important, and again, the details don't matter here, it's the colors that do. In that faded mauve, if you like, through the center, the main portion, the left is at the top, the right wing is at the bottom of this chart. The three parties in the center, the SPD I've introduced, the Center Party, which was a Catholic party established in Imperial Germany, and the DEP was the Democratic Party. Those three parties made up was known as the Weimar Coalition. It's not to be confused with the Weimar Republic. They were the three parties that backed the Republic from the beginning and continued to do so. And what this shows is that the first election on the left-hand side of 1919, of January, the one for which I showed the posters, those parties together received about 75% of the popular vote. Thereafter, beginning in 1920, in the second election, their share dropped to 50 or just below. They never again commanded that kind of majority. The bottom, you can see the NSDAP, the DNVP is a conservative party I introduced through those posters, and then the NSDAP until the mid-period has no role, and then in the final elections, of course, it becomes a very large chunk. What's misleading about this chart is that what appears to be a movement leftward by the three parties of the so-called Weimar coalition is actually a movement rightward. The whole spectrum was pushed right by the pressure that came. So if you look then, and I can only, of course, drop in at a couple of points along the way. This is the election of 1928. So almost a decade after the first election, this is the Democratic Party, one of those that was a strong supporter of the Weimar Republic. And this is cleanse the Reich, cleanse the nation, vote for the German Democratic Party. But you can see the images here. Germany is depicted as somehow oozing creatures which are Nazi, communist, and I would also say militaristic. And I can't say that there's significance necessarily in this push from north to south. There might be, but you can see the scraping off of these creatures that have oozed. If you like, it's a picture of a different kind of swamp compared to the one that we saw with the poster from the other side of the political spectrum with the red swamp. And then this from the last election before Hitler was appointed, national election of November 32, where the SPD is putting its finger on Marxism, or the communists on the left, and then the Nazis on the right, those two characters that are being held. And you can see just how dark the image has become, the struggle which is imagined going on in this democracy. And the caption says, these two are guilty that the gentleman's club, in other words, the old elites, are still ruling, and that it gets worse for the working class every day. Vote for the Social Democratic Party. Now, all this is a view from fairly high above, fairly general. I want to ask some questions about how we should manage it, even with this amount of material. So how should we implot the Weimar Republic, which is really our question? Should it be seen as a tale of heroic overcoming in the face of very significant challenges? Should we see it as a tragedy, given the way it ended? Even one which was ill-fated from the beginning, that is, foreseeable in the way it was born? Or could we approach it ironically, as a kind of comic relief, given how it stumbled from one post to the next? It's striking how much historians have approached the Weimar Republic as a location for sorting out those kinds of implotments, which is another way of saying for sorting out the moral lessons that we should take from such an experience. Let me give you a couple examples. The first is from a recent book on democracy and dictatorship in modern Europe. It starts this way. Understanding the fate of the Weimar Republic is perhaps the most important and difficult task facing a student of European political development. When I read that, I think, well, maybe there should be a special class of historians for these most important and difficult tasks. Maybe I should hand that one off. The second is actually my own. This is from something I published a quarter century ago. It was a review article, Crisis as Normalcy, Trauma as Condition, trying to make sense of Weimar. I opened it this way. For anyone reflecting on the might-have-beens, as well as the bitter realities of the 20th century, the Weimar Republic is an inescapable point of reference. It's an inflection of the first quote, but it more or less says the same. We can't go around the Weimar Republic. And looming behind all of this, of course, unspoken pretty much so far, is, of course, Hitler. The kinds of claims that we make about the significance of what happened to Weimar wouldn't mean the same thing if Hitler hadn't followed. Germany could have ended up in some kind of presidential dictatorship without Hitler. As Jill told you, I taught a course on Hitler for a number of years. And the more I spent time around the materials and reflecting on this, the more I'm convinced that Hitler is so unique as to be almost unrepeatable. We can debate that, of course, happily, but that was the conclusion I came to. If there hadn't been Hitler, it probably would have been some kind of presidential, autocratic state. And then, who knows what would have happened after that. But it would not have been someone like Hitler. Revisionist, yes, of course. That was across the board in terms of destroying the Treaty of Versailles and making Germany great again. Yes, but not what Hitler was about. Hitler was about, in the first week he was chancellor, he sat down with his commanders-in-chief and he mapped for them where he was headed. Didn't have a timetable. Destroyed democracy, destroyed pacifism, destroyed Marxism, both parties of the left, social democratic and communist. And democracy, of course, means all the others. Prepare the nation for war. That's the simple. This was in the first week he was chancellor. So, I don't see another Hitler, but happy to take questions on that. We can talk about it later. Main point is we would have seen Weimar quite differently without Hitler as the outcome, right? We would view it from another angle. So the big theme here is why history matters. So I want to pause for a minute in the middle of this and suggest 4 hypotheses about history and, if I might, with my colleagues present, historians. Number 1. Historians hold the world together. They do that more than economists, politicians, military leaders, and pundits of various kinds. Historians are therefore vastly undervalued and grossly underpaid. Now, that all holds until you look at the world and ask, so what about the state of this world they hold together? Maybe we should rethink that salary race. I'll leave that with you. Number 2, this holding together of the world rests on the capacity to make meaning or sense, which is in principle absolute. Let me give you an illustration. Some of you will be familiar with the debate about whether the Holocaust was a unique event. I've just said Hitler's unique, so here I'm hung already. But again, you can push me on this later. To say that the Holocaust can't be explained, which is what is implied here. I think I can explain Hitler. But to say that the Holocaust can't be explained is to lead to a dead end as a historian. If the Holocaust is outside the explanatory compass of the historian, it's outside history. And I would say in professional terms that if a historian can't explain something, then at least in that field they need to withdraw and hand it off to someone else who believes they can. So that's number 2. The third is all meaning-making or sense-making that the historian offers is inherently and inescapably moral. There's a long theory to this, which I won't give you. All I'll comment is that the subtitle in my title, The Moral of the Story is redundant. Without it, I would be looking for moral lessons, and I'm going to guess that you would not only be disappointed, but confused if I didn't in some way address that question. And finally, borrowing from the leading historical theorist of the last generation, Hayden White, it's impossible to tell a story without moralizing. They belong to each other. I've not seen anyone able to refute White or even attempt to do so. To tell a story is to moralize. What's at stake, to use White's taxonomy, is how best to do it, as romance or epic, tragedy, comedy, satire, or irony. Okay, that's my interlude about the role of the historian. I'll look in depth at several things for a few minutes before I come to conclusions. The Weimar Republic has often been looked at as though it were a baseball game with extended strikes. How many strikes were against it? Well, no one gives Weimar just 2 or 3. 5, 8. I was looking at some old notes and I found 2. historians, one who gave 5 strikes, and those were just the immediate strikes, not the long-term ones, against Weimar, another 8. So, and you could multiply those depending on how you break them down. That's certainly an approach. There's all kinds of things. There were attempts to overthrow Weimar from very early on, from the left and from the right. Workers and unrepentant militarists, I would say, from the right. The territorial losses we pointed to. We'll talk in a minute about the great hyperinflation. And then when the Great Depression came at the end of the 1920s, parliamentary government was effectively gridlocked. And presidential powers enshrined in the Constitution kicked in. And I just want to emphasize again, Hitler and the NSDAP were not responsible for that paralysis, not in the first instance. They were the beneficiaries of it. They got, if you like, to pick up the pieces. And they were the beneficiaries because President Hindenburg refused to look to the left for a solution to Germany's governmental crisis. He would only look rightward. And the Nazis were the only mass party on the right. That's a really simple formula, but it works. And I'm convinced that that's what happened effectively. And Hitler was appointed in January 1933 with the appearance of democratic practice. It did fulfill the formal norms. Okay. So let's modulate the approach from strikes against and just suggest several things that are relevant here. You could put them under that category if you like. First of all, of course, Weimar was an unanticipated and sudden outcome. No one planned it. There was a push for democratization during the war and the possibility, but if Germany had won the war, things would have turned very differently. Neither those who welcomed it nor those who opposed it were prepared. Despite that, Weimar achieved compromises between sharply conflicting worldviews and understandings of how to organize and govern national affairs. And that extended even into the realm of compromise in 1918 between industry and the working class, with agreement on working hours and bargaining rights. Third thing is that the economic crises of the great inflation or hyperinflation in the early 20s, culminating in 1923, and those of the Great Depression, I would suggest, are of an order of magnitude beyond what we're familiar with. Very difficult to comprehend. Especially in the hyperinflation, in an interesting way, the real became surreal, or maybe it was the other way around. The surreal became real. That image I started with was children playing with stacks of worthless currency bound together when it literally was worthless. So here, just to go into the topsy-turvy without going into details, it's better than a graph. It becomes almost like a log scale to do it this way. So the German mark lost about half its value between the beginning and end of the First World War, and then it began to slide right away. There were some arrests, there were some pauses, but from mid-1922 on, you can see it goes into free fall, and especially from the beginning of 1923 January with the invasion of French and Belgian troops to try to make good its claims on reparations from the Ruhr, to end up at 4.2 trillion marks to a dollar. And Germany effectively, and this is a side that historians know, it might not be familiar to you, but what Germany effectively did through inflation, and it was partially deliberate, is pay off its massive war debts to its own citizens, i.e. war bonds that had been purchased by Germans were now worthless. So it dispossessed its own people to free itself of this massive financial obligation. One of my favorites, the sketch isn't really clear, but it's a spoof on Noah's Ark. And you can see the animals are floating off in the water, the floods happen, but all that matters is to rescue the printing presses for currency because they had to employ, I think at the peak there was something like 150 different printing presses busy trying to get the new marks out in ever greater denominations when they went from thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions to billions. Save the currency press. And another way of thinking about this, and this is striking and speaks to the human dimension of the great inflation, is that you can see on those columns, the left one, rent. If you look at the top, those figures aren't way out of line with what we might anticipate for a salaried employee. Not way out of line. But as you go down, you can see rents couldn't possibly keep up with the inflation, so rent became free. On the other hand, food became enormously dear and hard to get. Again, we won't go into the details of this, but there you can see the pattern. It just drastically shifted what real life was like. And one of the symptoms, crime rates, and you can see that great spike in the middle corresponds to 1923. In the midst of that much turmoil and deprivation and scrounging, crime rates shot up. So that's without going into stories, there's endless stories about this, that's the big picture of the great inflation. And what I would comment is less surprising than the rising crime and then the emergence of separatist movements in the Rhineland. There was also violent revolution, Hitler's attempt at a putsch in Munich in November of 1923, and there were pressures from the left in other parts of the country. That a great coalition was formed, crossing parties that had previously not been able to sit together. And with the aid of emergency decrees, they ended passive resistance that was killing the country. You can ask me about that after, if you like. Created a new currency, and virtually overnight, confidence was restored to the economy. It was like a miracle. But it rested on the willingness, you could say, the blindness of governmental authorities up until this point in pushing a totally suicidal policy of passive resistance and just printing money to try to make up the difference. But it's no small feat that they were able to deal with this crisis. The everyday madness, the trauma of the hyperinflation did not undo the democratic compromise. There's reasons for that I won't go into, but we could talk about later if you like. That's followed by what are known as the relatively stable or golden years of the Weimar Republic, in which, to take this one example, although this shows all kinds of other things, but if you can see the dates at the bottom, the peak in the second highest peak is before the First World War, and then the high peak on the right-hand side is just before the Great Depression at the end of the 20s. So this shows a massive increase and then drop off at the end of the war and then increase again. So it comes back in the late 20s to the level of 1913. I should just comment, and this is relevant for why history matters, the terms we give to things. If you look on the far left, in the early 1870s, that little flat spot, can you see that? At the time, that was known as the Great Depression. It was a slowdown in the fantastic growth of that era. This chart, of course, stops before the Great Depression has its major impact, but as I said, it drops down to about 60% of the peak. There's the unemployment rate that corresponds to the experience of Great Depression with that massive peak. But what's also interesting and significant is up until 1923, you can see that unemployment was very low. One thing that inflation did was serve effectively full employment and recovery of the economy. Put it back on its feet after the fall off in the second half of the war. So, and then the mid-1920s, the so-called stable period, saw stubbornly high, in relative terms, unemployment. And the reasons for that I'll show you here momentarily. And then, of course, from 1929, it spiked in 1932, that's the peak there, at about 30%. 1 in 3 workers, according to official stats, 1 in 2 households Some stats, so that's 6 million persons officially, but some statistics with casual and part-time workers push that up in the 8 to 9 million range. So well over a third of the German workforce. This, by point of comparison, this is the age profile of Canada's population not long ago. You can see that my generation is effectively the largest generation, the baby boomers, as of 2017. So I put that there so you can see the difference. There's the German population. The white bars are 1910, and the black bars are 1925. And the black bars, well, in the contrast with the white, reveal several things. If you look up the left-hand side in the age bracket, what is it, 25 to 45? That's the generation of men killed in the First World War. And then you look at the very strange configuration below that with the white bars pushed in for the 5 to 10-year-olds. And then to a lesser extent, the 5 to 10-year-olds are those who were not born during the war. And the bars below that for the 1 to 5s or 1 to 4s are those who were not born in the aftermath of the war, with the missing generation of young men. What's also significant here, look at where the largest age group in the population is. It's in sort of 15 to 19, something like that, in 1925. This is the last large cohort of births before the First World War, before the birth rate started to drop off significantly. And they came into the workforce precisely when the workforce could not absorb them. So one of the tragedies of the Great Depression is that it was intensified and problematized by this young generation. At the time, by the way, it would be normal for Germans in the age bracket, 15, 16, 17. That's when they would generally start employment. University was a rare, yes?
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I would have expected male-female imbalance somewhere between 20 and 30, and I don't see one. Am I missing something?
Well, you can see on the right-hand side, it doesn't have the cut. And now, of course, it's stretched over many years, over about a 20-year cohort. Whoop. No problem. Yeah, that's what I hit. Anyway, it doesn't show dramatically because it's stretched over so many different ages, but you can see that on the right-hand side, it's consistent in the black bars, but not on the left-hand side. Let's draw some conclusions and then reflect on what this might mean for us. The Depression then, unlike the hyperinflation, left a much deeper mark and had much more profound political consequences. The way I think about it is that they were both very dramatic crises, traumatic crises, but they had asymmetrical consequences. And the difference, I think, is the fact that the hyperinflation was overcome relatively quickly and with decisiveness. It was like day and night. The world had changed back to normal after this madness of the previous year in particular, and especially the last 6 months. That didn't happen with the Depression. It was a trough that lasted. Both impacted the everyday life of the vast majority of the population, but the Depression had the longer-term effect in radically throwing people out of work and depressing wages. My final slide. This is an unemployment line headed to an employment office, and this is well before the depths of 1932. This is when the employment rate has jumped, but nowhere near the peak that we saw. You can see in the background left the swastika, and painted on the building there is "Vote for Hitler." So unlike even the war, the Depression had a demoralizing impact on the German people. It couldn't be rationalized as the war could be rationalized, as a common cause and national sacrifice. Even with all the bloodletting, that was the rationale. Instead, it was immiseration, demoralization, and desperation. On that gloomy note, let me suggest several ways in which interwar Germans, or Germans of the 1920s, might respond to us in the 2020s, particularly on the question of democratic potential and pitfalls. First thing, as I suggested earlier, these Germans endured personal and collective trauma and dislocation on a level which is foreign to most of us, beginning with the almost 2 million deaths of young males in the war, and with roughly twice that number wounded. How we would respond to something comparable and where we would look to blame, I think, are open questions. The critical issues of our time I see as of a different kind and dimension than those faced by Weimar. And I haven't even mentioned here, or only in passing without any stats, but it's worth remembering that in the Weimar period, thousands of lives were lost to political violence of various kinds and the repression of political violence. That would be another topic. Number two, crisis conditions can, as in war, foster consensus and willingness to compromise, even with a multi-party system rather than a two-party system. Weimar demonstrated such possibilities in the first half of the 1920s, despite the fundamental antagonisms inherited from the imperial period. The Depression, as I've argued, undermined those possibilities because it made the critical question of who was going to bear the political cost and the real cost for decisions unbearable. Third, if Weimar were to speak to us, it would, I think, be by turns baffled or bemused by our use of the language of war for other challenges. From the war on drugs, the war on terror, or the war on the coronavirus, the metaphoric use of the term suggests a need to generate consensus on the level achieved by a state of war, such as that of August 1914, and with it, a rationale for unity of command and control. We can talk about that if you like. Finally, the 1920s offer a perspective on consensus as a goal in principle. We enjoy the shared assumption that democracy, if not an ideal approach to managing human affairs, is the preferred, or as a professor once told me, the least bad approach to governing human affairs. A substantial portion of Germans in the 1920s can be forgiven for not yet being so convinced. Despite that, I would still argue that until relatively late, the possibilities of democratic pluralism remained open, as did the processes, the actual functioning of democratic pluralism. Let me leave you with the words of a philosopher from 2 centuries ago, Wilhelm von Humboldt, reflecting on history and the historian. I quote, "History does not primarily serve us by showing us through specific examples, often misleading and rarely enlightening, what to do and what to avoid. History's true and immeasurable usefulness lies rather in its power to enliven and refine our sense of acting on reality. And this occurs more through the form attached to events than through the events themselves." Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions if there are questions in the house. I see a question. Yeah, okay, thanks. I see one at the back. Yes. Yell it out as much as you can, because
I'm thinking about your population graph there. Why were there so many women missing in that age group where the men were missing because of war?
well, that was the question I got, but maybe I didn't understand it because it's the younger generation that wasn't born of females as well as males. But the other chart, no, did I miss something?
Well, I thought there were, that they lost a bunch of men because they were killed during the war. And I thought that was why that was that big notch.
Yes. No.
No.
No. The war dead are here.
Oh, okay, I understand now.
These are those who were not born.
I get it.
And so equal male, female, whereas this is a fairly straight line and this one has, doesn't look so dramatic a chunk out of it, but given, if you could picture this here, so we're talking roughly 2 million. Is that the question that you asked as well? Is that, yeah, okay. Thanks for the question.
I get it, thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yes.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, Michael.
So, just a question that's quite simple, but quick difference between Germany, Prussia, Deutschland, Weimar, what was it? You mentioned
Okay.
another land, Rhineland.
Right. Okay. So Germany was constituted as a series, a mix of things. Principalities is a generic term. Some of them were kingdoms like Bavaria and Prussia that had kings before 1918. The main structure was preserved, so Prussia remained as it had been earlier, a very large portion of Germany. We would call it a province. In Germany, they're called states. It had its own legislature. It had its own government. Essentially duplicated the party structures. And one of the interesting, often referred to as an irony of the period, is that Prussia, historically conservative, became what is known as the bulwark of German democracy. The coalition of those three Weimar parties ruled virtually throughout the period in Prussia. And there's interesting trade-offs between national and Prussian politics, as you can imagine. It would be as though Canada were constituted with the populations of, what, Ontario and Quebec together. I haven't done the actual math. Someone may have these figures in their head. Yeah. So it's a state within the nation after 1918. I should add, and it was before within the German Reich. The Prussian king before 1918 was the emperor. The emperor was the Prussian king. Okay, so when the empire was formed in 1871, the Prussian king got promoted. He was still the Prussian king, but he became the emperor as well. So he had a dual role.
And the Weimar Republic was all of them combined?
Yes, the republic is what's left over that is democratized, and after, of course, the territories are lost by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Yeah. David?
Tom, how many democratic states were created in Eastern and Central Europe at the end of the war? And how many of them survived? Because is Germany really unique? It's often treated as such, but it seems to me it's actually pretty typical of what happened to all those democratic states.
Yeah. So did everyone hear that? Okay. So David's question, and it's a really good one, is there anything unique about the failure of democracy in interwar Europe? And the answer is no, especially in Central, but not only in Central Europe. In the context of the Depression, widespread, Poland, Spain, for instance. And so, and it comes back to the point I made earlier, that the failure of Weimar democracy wouldn't weigh very heavily on us if Hitler hadn't been the outcome. It would have just been one more of the failed democratic states in interwar Europe. But the focus comes on it for that reason. And with the focus, I think also an understandable interest in the mechanisms by which democracy works, and I've tried to pull out just a handful of those, and to suggest that it worked in some ways better than could have been anticipated. The case could be made, of course, that there was a longer tradition in Germany, which there was, of the left liberals and the center party and the social democrats pushing for democratization, which then became increasing pressure during the war itself, and some of which was accommodated by the imperial regime. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, you talk about the strikes against Weimar, which is loss of territory, loss of war, loss of colonies, what you call it, having to pay pensions, war dead, but it's the depression, but it's not unique in any of those. I mean, France
Yep.
suffers the same thing. Maybe it had a longer democratic route, but how come France took a different route?
Okay, thank you for the question, and I'll repeat it because I'm sure you didn't hear it back there, correct? So the question is an elaboration of the previous one, and it's also very good, which is, given that the Great Depression impacted a much broader region than Germany, it was global, France took a different route, Britain took a different route. It didn't succumb to this kind of dictatorship that Germany did. There's several ways to come about that. One of them is that for reasons which I didn't go into, but which are actually quite interesting, the internal workings of the German economy, German export tradition, some of the struggles it faced in the 1920s with a general downturn in world trade, is that Germany, along with the US, was the most sharply hit, deeply struck by the Depression. France's experience of the Depression was much more drawn out. You might throw my argument back at me, fair enough, about how even the one in Germany endured longer than the apex of the hyperinflation. But it was, if you like, shared over a longer period and not as intense. Historians, of course, make the argument that democracy in France had a longer tradition. I don't know if that's a good answer, or in Britain, for instance, but it is the case that Germany, along with the US, and then you could ask the question about the US, I suppose, fair enough, but Germany, along with the US, was most profoundly hit by the Depression. In the German case, it was rebound from the US because a lot of the investments in Germany came from the so-called Dawes Plan of 1924. Lots of short-term investments from the United States in Germany, when those were recalled in 1929, 1930, that led to serious crisis. Yeah, Yuri.
Can you speak of that chart where you showed the how the right grows and the left sort of
Right.
by over the course of those 14 years? It suggests that the population is beginning to think this sort of governance is not working, this sort of governance will work better.
Yes.
So could you discuss a little bit about what left and right meant back then? Is it nationalism? Is it economic? What exactly are these parties doing?
Okay. Big question. Great question. So to repeat it again, it's about, so with that shrinkage, that's the chart you're referring to, correct, Yuri? Yeah, so what explains this and what's going on the left and right for this to take place? With the NSDAP, the big jump comes in 1930, roughly September 1930, roughly a year into the Depression. But otherwise, there's a lot of ways to think about this. One is that Germans voted for the Republican parties, the three, DDP, SPD, and Center Party, in January 1919, because it was a solution when there was no solution. The old regime had collapsed, the Kaiser abdicated. He was actually abdicated after a fashion, he was told, like Biden. It's your time. And he sort of had to be told. But apart from that, once he's gone, so what fills the gap? What goes in the vacuum? And so it was an endorsement of the possibility of a republic. That's one thing. The second thing, the threat in late 1918, 1919 was from, even though the numbers were small, from the left, from the red. There actually was working class uprising in January 1919. The Independent Social Democratic Party and then the Communist Party, which was formed right at the beginning of 1919, were engaged in revolt in Berlin. It's the context in which the leaders of the communists, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were assassinated by right-wing, not really protectors of the Republic, but that's the form they functioned in at that time. So the threat was from the left at that time. And you can see the old right, the DNVP, is very weak. What happens in 1920 is that the working class is alienated from the government because in response to an attempt from the right in March of 1920 to overthrow the Republic, what's known as the Cap Putsch, there was an uprising in the West, in the industrial district, which was put down in blood by the same persons, more or less, who were responsible for the attempt to overthrow the Republic from the right. So there was alienation from the Republic on those grounds. After that, the question of the Treaty of Versailles, which was also in that election of 1920, the treaty didn't come down until the spring of 1919, so after the first election, it was a shock. A cruel shock. And I should add here that one of the things the Germans could agree on, one of the very few things there was national consensus on, is that the Treaty of Versailles was a disgrace, punitive, unfair, in the term that they used. It was a dictated peace, which it was, formally. It was not a negotiated peace. So the national backlash to the Treaty of Versailles is another aspect of that. Any other questions? Yes?
I wonder if you could address the question of moral cowardice of people in power around Hitler in 1933. Do you think they were, like, compared to other countries in similar situations, were they, people kind of, once upon a time anyway, like, kind of the standard historiography was that politicians either thought that they could use Hitler, and
Yes.
business people thought that they could profit from him. Do you think that's unusual for Germany at the time compared to other countries? But was there something different at that time?
Thank you for the question. Did everyone hear that? Okay, the question is moral cowardice, or how the politicians in the system, particularly those on the right, who I think is the implication, who are responsible for seeing that Hitler was appointed in January 1933. Is there something unusual about that? I joked earlier with my colleague Kristen Simmons when I got difficult questions. I was just going to ask Kristen to answer it. I don't know what you would say to that question, Kristen. My simple answer is I don't think so. There has been a tendency in the past to think about Weimar political leaders as less than up to the task, sort of an inferior brand. They lacked experience of the kind required, fair enough, but I'm not so convinced that that's the case, actually. I think some of them were very good negotiators. Many years ago, when I was young, I got myself in trouble. I was in a totally different context, and we were asked to suggest who we thought the most effective politician had been in any context. So this was maybe around 1970, so the Second World War wasn't too far away. And I answered Gustav Stresemann, who was the foreign minister, and in 1923, briefly, he was the chancellor of that grand coalition I referred to. And I could tell I'd crossed the line. I'd picked a German statesman from the interwar period in the presence of, understandably, persons who'd been impacted directly by the Second World War. But Stresemann is someone I would think of who could see what was possible. He started out ideological, but he was a nationalist. He was for aggrandizement in the First World War, for expansion. But he came to a very practical assessment of Germany's place in Europe, and he did what he could to work with that on behalf of the nation. He got precious little thanks for it. And the great dilemma for Stresemann is that his own party, or half his own party, was against him as much as his opponents were. They were uncertain about his role. But to the broad question, I don't see moral cowardice. I see massive problems, some of which were mastered and some not. And we could talk about the Great Depression and why the response to it was the way it was. Even for the chancellor at the time, Heinrich Brüning, the hunger chancellor, as he was referred to, who insisted on a policy of deflation so that there wasn't a repeat of the Great Inflation, and to try to get out from under reparations. It was a foreign policy ploy. He was an earnest man. You could say he's wrong with hindsight, but I wouldn't want to be in his shoes. Questions here? Let's, yeah?
I want to follow up on Stresemann.
Yeah, quickly, yep.
And when we say why history matters, how much can one person be? I have the impression he was, without him, that what you call miracle solution to the hyperinflation wouldn't have happened.
Okay.
Would you agree?
Great question. Can we do something right now, I think? Because can we take several questions in a row and then I'll see what I can answer? Is that Aaron and then Eric? Yeah.
A broad thematic question. You've mentioned, and this is something I've thought about a fair bit since I was first introduced to Hayden White's work under Hitler himself, the utility of different forms of employment, particularly in applying that in contemporary circumstance. You've alluded probably more to irony in this. I don't know if that's just a coincidence, but in any case, it's beyond a sort of absurdist impulse. What really is the utility of plot and of irony? How do we use that, particularly where we stand now?
Okay. Thank you. So let's, again, you'll remind me if I need reminding, Eric and then Himmet, and then I'll respond as best I can in sequence, okay?
You're not going to be able to handle all of it. But,
Well, then I'll get you to come up, Eric.
no, ask Krista. Towards the end of your talk, you used the word trauma.
Yep.
So, since you used the word, I can ask you about it. You have surely described the most amazing, remarkable conditions for a collective or social trauma that we're ever going to find, with the war, the hyperinflation, the depression, and so on. And of course, the word comes up in many other contexts, as you know, and can even be applied perhaps to recent, segments of the population in the United States. My question is, how useful is the concept of trauma for historians?
Okay, super question. Thank you. Himmet.
Simple question. You made a comment that you don't believe Hitler can be duplicated. Why?
So he's hung me on my comment. Fair enough. So let's start in reverse, okay? I say that simply because the more I study Hitler, the more the intersection, the most unlikely intersection of person, history of personal history for Hitler as an outsider, and circumstances stand out to me. It's a rare constellation, is all I can say. It's a super rare constellation, as best I can decipher it. And I've thought quite a bit about that. But even if you think within his own party, he had some quite effective operators. Unscrupulous, but effective. I don't think any of them could have taken his place. Just within the broader circle. He was, in that context, in my view, happy to entertain, countervailing arguments, but that's my take on that one. Thanks. Eric, to your question on trauma. My general response would be to reflect, and I'm thinking of your work on seafaring in this context now, about experiences of previous generations which are just outside my experience. One of the things I had in my mind as I was thinking about this, Bruce Cockburn. How many know Bruce Cockburn, the Canadian singer-songwriter? Many years ago in an interview, this would have been in the 70s probably. He's a few years older than I am, but he was asked, about what he'd gone through in life, and he said something like, well, I managed to survive my adolescence. And I would say that as a baby boomer, that's my experience. And so trauma is relative. That's all to say, trauma is relative to what you are inured to. And so when I think of Germans, the experience of the war, that's inconceivable to me, and others have written about this. Those who ended up in the trenches weren't just working class, but a core of them were. And they knew what work was. Hard physical labor. This is before the introduction of serious mechanization, in Germany at least, in mines, for instance, which took place in the 1920s. It's of another world, in a sense. So as soon as we talk about trauma, then we have to locate it relative to experience. And so I look at Germans from the First World War, the loss of life, family bereavement, loss of fathers and then orphan kids, and then the confusion, the hyperinflation, the stresses and the strains. It helps, amongst other things, obviously, to make sense of the attractiveness of someone like Hitler, who promised that he was going to make everything better again. Yeah. So we can chat more about that. Aaron, remind me. Oh, yes. No, help me with your question. Oh, yeah. How you implot things. We don't often think about this when we do it. We just do it. Weimar, I would take, for those of you who knew anything about it, coming in, you would go, that's a tragedy. Hayden White says that the most interesting historians are those who don't write in only one mode. So it could be tragic, but it's also ironic. Or you could approach it satirically and tragically. It could be epic and tragic instead of a tale of romantic overcoming and victory. And his argument is that those kinds of histories last, and the rest of them, who only have a single moral point, don't. It's an interesting observation. And then back to, yes, Gustav Stresemann, whether 1923 would have been possible without him. I'm inclined to say you're right, inclined to say in this regard. He was widely seen prior to stepping in August 1923 as the only person who could pull together both the team and have the credibility to pull this off. And let me add something to this, which we also don't take, it's not part of our culture in the way it once was. The ability of persons like a Stresemann to stand up and speak on a topic cogently, persuasively, passionately, for maybe 2 hours at a time. Not just to relay information, but to change the way people think about things. Now, Hitler, of course, was a master at this. That was his vocation. I have a topic when I teach the Hitler course, I just call it the voice. It wasn't disembodied, of course, but he had something that when he got in front of people, he became someone who connected with them, and some kind of torrent came out of him, And he was not practiced. I learned this first when I was studying British history as a grad student of the 19th century, where they would, what we call filibuster, they would stand and make speeches through the night so that they couldn't call a motion. And you can't just talk to yourself. You have to have resources at your disposal. And of course, they had resources. They had the classical literature at their disposal. They had the Bible at their disposal. Their metaphors, their images, their passion were related to those things. They had an arsenal built in, which is harder and harder to find. So Stresemann, in that sense, he was canny, capable, and he, all in as well, all in. Politics as vocation, in the Max Weber sense. Yeah. Vanessa, I think you had a question earlier. Sorry, I missed you.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, I was just, I was really struck by how you kind of talked about how like the term war has kind of transcended to kind of, be used in areas that, are kind of foreign to it, like war on drugs and et cetera. I've also kind of similarly kind of thought about this in my head, and at least the conclusions that I've kind of raised or thought about as to why it's kind of conjured is not so much to do against the enemy outside the nation, but with the enemy within the nation. The war on drugs is not so much about the importers of the drugs, but those who use it or those who sell it on the street. So I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think that that using the term war to create unity is to do more with the outside or those within the nation?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the question is, using the metaphor of war outside the context of war itself, for these other things I mentioned, like war on drugs, war on terror, is that something that's targeted more at internal or external challenges? I frankly don't know. What I would just reflect, going back to Eric's question, is that trauma and war are aligned. And one way of thinking about it is that war provides a kind of maximization of what's at stake. In war, everything else gets set aside. All other causes are subordinate. Focus, purpose. And my sense is that could be in either direction. When there's an outside threat, in some ways it's easier to muster, but not necessarily. It's been applied with a certain amount of cogency. I raise it simply because I'm curious about it too, and how it functions just as you are. So thank you. Yeah. Jill?
Yeah.
Do we have time? How much time do we have?
You're fine. If you're not tired of questions yet.
I'm okay. If the rest of you are okay. Yeah, sure.
Tom, did I hear you say that Hitler promised his people that he would make Germany great again?
I was being just a little bit facetious, of course, in the phrasing. But, well, what Hitler did, I somewhat facetiously referred to Hitler promising to make Germany great again. It wasn't exactly his language. What Hitler promised to do, to come back to Vanessa's question, was to rid Germany of its internal enemies. And then he wasn't content with restoring what was lost at the end of the First World War. That was very clear right in the first week. That was clear before too, but in terms of talking with his military commanders. He had a program, not timelined per se, but he had an ambition to acquire space. And the famous duo of space and race, and it would be based racially. He would push out the unworthy races and occupy their spaces, if you want to put it in a simple formula. That's quite different And I'm glad, thanks for asking the question. That's quite different from making Germany great again. It's way more, the term at the time would have been restoring Germany's great power status. Okay? But he was interested in, he had ambitions far beyond restoring Germany's great power status. It's a great question. Jill.
So I had a first-year student accost me this morning in a hall and demand that I compare Hitler and Trump, and was terrified. I mean, she was nervous.
Okay.
And so I think I've already heard the answer. I think that we are not living in the Great Depression. I think we are not living in the aftermath of war. Do you have any other advice? Because I'm sure we all know people who are making that comparison.
Right.
And here's an opportunity to give us all some historical perspective.
Okay. So Jill's question, she said she was accosted in the hall this morning by a student who demanded that she sort out the difference between Hitler and Trump. She needed, in other words, she needed reassuring, I think is what you're saying, right, Jill? She needed reassuring that Trump's victory yesterday is not a renewal of the Hitlerian threat. And then Jill followed that up by saying that I've suggested along the way already how I think there are important differences. I guess I have to acknowledge fairly that there are notable historians who've drawn the comparison, and the media has pulled on them. Anne Applebaum, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Someone said to me recently, I'm not sure what to do with this, but someone said to me recently, Trump's enemies take everything he says literally, and his friends take everything he says figuratively. Trump's enemies take everything he says literally, and Trump's friends take everything he says figuratively. One of the key differences I just spoke to, ambition. I have no indication that Trump's ambition is to rule the world. He is as unique as Hitler in a different way. That I would say there's a comparison. There's only one Trump in my book, at least in my experience. Maybe others of you have had experience in a role like that of someone like him. I have not. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't see him with that kind of program. He doesn't have a set of stormtroopers around him who are already practiced at beating up their political opponents and actually murdering them, which is what Hitler did. That was old hat by 1933 when he was appointed. Now, it was a two-way street. The conflicts were mostly between the Nazis and the communists, but they were street fights. It was violence. And in terms of the system, and I think even the response, I don't know how you read, but I was very interested in the time that I had last night and this morning to look at the response across the press in the US. And it's as though the temperatures come down, it seems to me, in the response. Now, maybe you read it differently, maybe you saw things I didn't see. But the fever pitch and the accusations have settled to say, we actually have a democracy, we have rules, the election's been won, there's going to be a peaceful transition of power. This is coming now from Harris and Biden. We're going to follow the rules. You tell me. I mean, this is something that each of us, of course, have been pressed to come up with some kind of response to in looking at the world we live in. Anything you want to reflect there, Jill?
I think you've given us the answer. I think that the circumstances are completely different. I think that he does not have the kind of damage to repair that Hitler had to repair. So I'm optimistic, but I'm not a specialist in the period. So.
Well, I'm not a specialist on U.S. politics, so no apologies for the question, but just to be honest, I'm a interested observer, as I assume you are, trying to make sense of the historian, in that sense-making mission.
I'd like to point out that Hitler never had to be reelected, he just had to be killed. Big difference.
Okay, question at the back. Yeah.
Just wonder about what was going back to Weimar Republic, what was the role of the press? Was there actually a strong free press at the time?
Depends what you mean by free press. There were, as I say, non-aligned papers that claimed they had no political commitment or affiliation. In practice, they leaned in certain directions without being explicitly in support of those. Something I didn't talk about that was in my sort of draft. How do we position ourselves to give answers to the kinds of questions that we're asking tonight? Where do we stand? As a historian, the question comes to me, do I go to the past to find the values by which I should assess it? Or do I import those from the present? Or is it some mix of the two? In practice, I think it's a mix of the two. But then it gets more interesting when you ask, so who do I listen to? Back then and now. It's a hypothesis. On my part, you can do with it as you will, that the most fruitful approach is to look for people who are insider outsiders. Look for people who know the system inside out, but in some way are outsiders to it. Or vice versa. Look for people who are outsiders, who get inside somehow, and then can relay what they find.
Can you give us an example?
Whew. Okay, yeah, thank you. So in the Weimar period, there were those on the left who were independent and they were harshly critical of Weimar, like Kurt Tucholsky. Harshly critical, they mocked it. Its ridiculousness, its pettiness, its petty bourgeois nature. But there were also those, I think one in particular, who was a direct target of the Nazis, Karl Ossietzky, who writes between worlds. He sees the foibles and the flaws on both sides. And those are the people I tend to listen to. But you have to know the inside to be able to do that effectively.
Who were these people? Was it newspaper writers or what?
He was a journalist, commentator.
So where did he write them? Like what newspaper did he write?
He wrote for an independent thing known as the World Stage, Weltbühne. And he wrote for other papers prior to that too. Publication outlets that would permit that. I mean, think about our landscape today. It's difficult. People like that can only go certain places. They're not welcomed. In general, I don't think, because they don't line up.
But this is also the time of the Daily Express and the Daily Mail mass circulation.
Okay.
Did Germany have something?
Yes. So then that's the other question that ties into what you asked, which is increasingly popular in the 1920s. It started before the 1920s, late in the 19th century, but increasingly popular was the so-called boulevard press, which was muckraking, scandal, film, sports, tourism, these kinds of things, where politics figured but not centrally. But that question you ask, I think, is really interesting. So, and one for all of us to reflect on. Who do I listen to? And if I listen to that person, can I listen to this person too? And my practice, perhaps as a historian, because I do the gamut as a historian from the far left to the far right. I do the same in my reading today. So, Jill.
I think we've had Tom on the hot seat for long enough. I think it's a good time for us to thank him very much for his talk. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and for your great questions. Our next talk will be the first Wednesday of December, so December 4th. One of the other department professors in our department, Jason Colby, will be here to talk about climate change, the human story. Again, talking about why history matters. All right. Thank you, everyone, and please register for your tickets when you come for next time, and we look forward to seeing all of you next month. Thank you.